The dry country outside the wire had a color that changed by the hour, and at this hour, just before the light came up over the scrubland, it was the gray of old ash. Nadia Cole sat on an ammunition crate with a spotting scope across her knees, watching a dust plume rise 9 kilometers out where nobody was supposed to be, and she did not move. Behind her, the camp was waking the way camps do, a generator coughing, a door slapping, somebody swearing at a coffee urn that had died in the night. None of it reached her. She had her eye on the plume and a stopwatch running in her head, counting the seconds it took the dust to travel between 2 fence posts a mile apart. And from that, she already knew how fast the vehicle under it was moving and roughly how heavy it was. A corporal named Beck came out to smoke and saw her sitting there and laughed. "Cole, you know you finished dead last, right? Whole selection course. They're still telling that story." "I heard," she said. She didn't turn around. "Then what are you looking at?" "A truck that's carrying too much to be a farmer's." Beck squinted out at the nothing and saw nothing. He shrugged and went back inside. And that was the thing about Nadia Cole that nobody had figured out yet. When she went quiet and still and stopped arguing, it was never because she had given up. It was because she had already seen the end of something the rest of them hadn't noticed had started. She had come dead last in the shooting course on purpose. She would tell you that if you asked her, and nobody ever asked her. If you're the kind of person who stays until the last number is counted, subscribe and tell me what city you're listening from. I want to know who's out there in the dark with me tonight. Because before this is over, a man who called her the worst shooter he'd ever seen is going to be screaming her name into a radio, begging her to take a shot no one else on earth would attempt, and she's going to be lying in the dirt with 1 round, doing the math on a wind she cannot feel. Stay to the end. You'll want to see his face. The base was called Firebase Wexler, and it sat on the high desert floor of a country whose name the men wrote home about and mispronounced. 900 meters of hardpan and gravel in every direction before the ground broke into ravines, and past the ravines the mountains stood up brown and folded like something a giant had crumpled and dropped. It was a place made of distance. The air was so dry it cracked your lips by noon, and so clear that a man on a far ridge looked close enough to shout at, which fooled new arrivals into thinking they understood the ranges here. They did not. Nadia had spent her first week doing nothing but sitting with the scope, learning how the light lied. Where she learned to read distance had nothing to do with a rifle. Her grandfather had been a surveyor in the flat brown country where she grew up, and when she was small he used to take her out before dawn with a theodolite and a steel tape and a striped rod, and he would set her 100 yards off and make her hold the rod plumb while he read the angles. She hated it at first, the cold, the dark, the standing still. But he had a way of talking that made the land feel like a thing you could negotiate with if you were honest enough. And he taught her that the eye is a liar and the numbers are the only truth. "You don't guess the distance, Nadia," he'd say, spitting to the side, screwing his eye against the little scope. "Guessing is for people who want to be wrong politely. You measure it twice. And if the ground says one thing and your gut says another, you believe the ground. The ground has been here longer than your gut." She was 9 the first time she ran a traverse that closed to the inch, and he didn't say well done because he never said well done. He just looked at her figures and looked at her and grunted and handed her the rod to carry back to the truck, which was the same as a medal from him. She carried it the whole 2 miles and didn't complain. And that was the last summer before he sold the business, and she went off to the person she would eventually become. The rifle came later, and it came easy because a rifle at distance is only a surveying problem that fights back. But the surveyor's habit, measure it twice, believe the ground, was the thing underneath the thing, and it was the reason she had come last in the course and didn't care. There was a letter in her footlocker she had not answered. It had been there 11 weeks. It was from a woman named Ruth Petroff, who ran a ranch 2 valleys over from where Nadia had grown up, and who had taught Nadia to drive at 14, and had once, in a bad winter Nadia never talked about, kept her fed for 2 months without ever making it a thing you had to be grateful for out loud. Ruth was not family. That was the part that made it hard. Family you owed by blood and could resent cleanly. Ruth had simply decided a half-feral teenager was worth the trouble and never asked for anything back, and now Ruth was selling the ranch, and the letter, 3 pages in a slanting hand, asked Nadia to come home before the sale closed and take anything she wanted from the place, because there were things in that house that ought to go to somebody who'd understand them. Nadia had read it once and put it away and not read it again. She told herself it was the deployment. It was not the deployment. It was that answering it meant choosing, and choosing meant admitting the ranch would stop existing, and some part of her had been keeping that valley alive by refusing to look at it. She could have written 3 lines. She had written nothing. 11 weeks. The man who made her time at Wexler a misery was a staff sergeant named Dale Hollis, and he was, to be fair to him, genuinely good. He'd made his reputation in a unit everybody respected. He could shoot the wings off a fly at 600 meters, and he had never once in his life doubted himself, which is a quality that looks like strength right up until it isn't. He'd read Nadia's file, attached, augmentee, finished last in selection, and he'd decided that told him everything. "Hey, everybody clear a lane," he said the first morning at the range, loud, for the benefit of the 8 men zeroing their rifles. "Cole's shooting. Anybody downrange, anybody in the next county, take cover." A couple of the men laughed because he was their sergeant, and you laugh. Nadia set her rifle down, adjusted her sling, and put 10 rounds into a group you could cover with a playing card at 300 meters, unhurried, and then looked up at him with no expression at all. "That the drill, Staff Sergeant?" "Beginner's luck," Hollis said, and walked off, and that was worse than if he'd stayed, because it meant he wasn't going to let a fact change his mind. But there was a warrant officer named Grady Salter who ran the intelligence shop, an older man, heavyset, 22 years in and long past caring what anybody thought of him, and Salter watched that group go into the target and said nothing at the range. Instead, that afternoon, he found Nadia in the shade of the vehicle bay, cleaning her rifle, and sat down on an overturned bucket with a groan and spread out a map between them. "You called a truck at 9 clicks this morning," he said. "Beck thought you were seeing things. I pulled the drone feed. There was a truck." "There's always a truck," she said. "Loaded, how you said. Riding low on the back axle." He tapped the map. "Show me how you knew." And she did. She showed him the 2 fence posts and the dust and the timing of it, and Salter listened the way a man listens when he's decided the person in front of him is worth the electricity it takes to run his brain, and by the end of it he was leaning over the map with her, arguing about ground he'd flown over 100 times and never really seen. When he stood up, his knees cracked like gunfire. 22 years, he said. "You just showed me something. Don't tell Hollis. He'll have an aneurysm." She almost smiled at that. Almost. There was a night, maybe her second week, when the power went out across the whole Firebase and the men sat around in the dark waiting for the generator crew to sort it out, and somebody produced a bottle of something they weren't supposed to have, and Nadia, who most of them still thought of as the quiet one who finished last, turned out to do a dead-perfect impression of the base commander's way of clearing his throat before bad news, and then of Hollis's range voice, "Anybody in the next county take cover," and even the men loyal to Hollis lost it in the dark, howling because she'd caught something true in it. For an hour, in the blackout, she was just funny and easy, and one of them, telling a story about her grandfather nearly rolling a truck into a river over a spooked heron, and a private named Ochoa laughed so hard he had to go outside. When the lights came back, they were half sad to see them. A mechanic named Foss saw the thing that stuck with him, though he could never have told you why it mattered. He was crossing the motor pool at dusk when he saw Cole field strip her rifle. That was all. But he'd watched 100 people break down a weapon, and they all did it like a chore, fast and clattering. Cole did it like her hands already knew where every piece was going to be before it got there. No wasted motion, no reaching, each part set down in a line on the cloth in the exact order it would go back. And she did it looking off at the ridgeline the entire time, not down at her hands, the way a person recites something they've known since childhood. Foss stopped for a second. He didn't have the words for it. It was just that watching most people do that job felt like watching them work, and watching her do it felt like watching water find the low ground. He went to dinner and didn't mention it to anyone, but he thought about it, off and on, for a long time. It broke on a Tuesday, in the middle of a sentence. Salter was standing in the operations tent telling a joke about a contractor's coffee habit when the radio on the table stopped being background noise. It was a patrol call sign, Ranger 26, and the voice on it had gone up half an octave in the particular way a voice does when the person is watching something terrible develop and trying to sound calm. A route clearance team and its security element, 14 men, had been moving through a village called Sarbond in the folded country to the north when the road behind them dropped out under a command wire charge and the road ahead filled with fighters coming down out of the compounds on the high side. They'd fallen back into a walled farm compound at the edge of the village, a mud brick square with one good wall and 3 bad ones, and they were pinned. The enemy held the high ground above them and a stone tower at the village edge that looked down into the compound like God's own bad idea. 14, Salter said, into the sudden quiet of the tent. 14 men in that compound. We get 14 out, or we don't. The distance from Wexler to Sarbond was too far for the fort's own weapons to reach. A relief column would take 3 hours over that ground, and the men in the compound did not have 3 hours. Air was weathered out. A dust storm was walking down from the north and had already grounded the rotary wing, and the fast air was 2 provinces away on another fire. 14, that was the number, and it did not include Nadia yet. The base commander was a lieutenant colonel named Owen Reyes, and it was Reyes who had signed off, 11 weeks earlier, on treating Cole as what her paperwork said she was. He stood over the map now with the muscles working in his jaw, and everybody in the tent knew what the only option was, and everybody watched him not want it. There's high ground southwest of the village, Salter said quietly. A finger ridge. One person could get onto it on foot ahead of the column and see the whole compound. Range to the towers about 1,200. Range to the high side fighting positions, more. One person, Reyes said. One person who can make those shots in this wind. You've got one of those. You've been letting Hollis call her a joke for 3 weeks. Reyes looked at Salter, and then he did the thing that cost him, which was to say it out loud in front of his staff. I read her file, and I believed the first line of it. That's on me. He turned to the runner. Get Cole. Tell her she's got the ridge. They kitted her in 11 minutes. Hollis watched her go without a word, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite contempt anymore, just confusion, like a man watching the furniture rearrange itself. Her first words on the net, once she'd cleared the wire in the back of a fast-moving truck with 2 of Salter's scouts, were not the words of an augmentee or an observer or the woman who finished last. Wexler, longbow, moving to the southwest finger. I'll have eyes on the compound in 20. Tell Ranger 26 to hold their good wall and stop trying to shoot back at the tower. They're just marking their own positions. Longbow out. In the tent, a private who had laughed at Hollis's joke 3 weeks earlier stopped chewing his gum. The truck could only take her part way. The last 2 kilometers to the finger ridge were up a dry watercourse, too narrow and too soft for the vehicle, and Nadia went up it on foot with the 2 scouts, Ochoa and a lean, quiet man named Priest, moving fast in the bad light with the dust storm still an hour off but announcing itself in the sky as a brown stain swallowing the northern stars. The watercourse forced them slow at the top where it fanned out into loose gravel, and the loose gravel was where the first thing went wrong. A fighter the enemy had pushed out onto the southern approach, a flank guard nobody had accounted for, opened up from a fold in the ground 40 meters to their right, and the world became noise. Nadia went flat behind a boulder the size of a washing machine, and felt rounds come off the top of it, and heard Priest returning fire in short controlled bursts to her left, and Ochoa yelling a direction. This was the part her file said she couldn't do. Up close, loud, chaotic, no time to measure anything. She made herself small and breathed and let Priest and Ochoa work because they were better at this 40 meters than she was, and when Ochoa's rounds walked the fighter's position quiet, she was up and moving again before the echo died, and none of them said a word about it. They reached the spine of the finger ridge as the sun cleared the far mountains and threw the whole valley into hard relief. And for the first time, Nadia looked down into Sarband and saw the shape of the problem entire. The compound holding the 14 men sat maybe 1,200 meters below and to the north, a mud brick square. She could see men in it, pressed against the one good wall, and she could see the muzzle flashes of the fighters up on the high side raking down into it. And she could see the tower, a squat stone thing at the village edge, 3 stories with slit windows, and in the top of it, the long, ugly silhouette of a heavy machine gun on a tripod, and that gun was the whole game. It sat above the compound and fired down into it, and the one good wall the men were sheltering behind was good against the high-side fighters, but useless against the tower, because the tower looked straight down over the top of it. "They can't move," Priest said, glassing it beside her. "Minute they break for the vehicles, that gun in the tower cuts them in half." "Then the tower goes first," Nadia said, and got down behind the rifle. She built her position slowly while Ochoa put the radio beside her ear, bipod on the flattest rock, pack under the toe of the stock. She read the range to the tower off the scope's reticle, and it came up 1,240, and then she read it again, because you measure it twice, and it came up the same. The wind was the problem. It always was. Out here in the high desert, the wind between her ridge and that tower moved through 3 different valleys, and it was not the same wind in any of them, and it was building as the storm came on. She watched the dust devils spinning up off the valley floor, and read them, and read the tilt of a thorn bush at 800, and built a firing solution in her head that she trusted to about half the width of the tower's window. Down in the compound, a corpsman named Ellis Wade was keeping men alive against the good wall, and it was Wade who took the first serious hit of the morning when a round from the high side found the gap where the good wall met a bad one, and Wade felt his leg go out from under him and knew before he looked that it was bad. He dragged himself back under cover and got a tourniquet on his own thigh with hands that had done it 100 times on other men, and then he lay against the mud brick and looked up at the tower and understood, the way the men around him understood, that the tower was going to kill all of them one at a time unless somebody made it stop. "Longbow, Ranger 2-6, a new voice, tight. "We got wounded and that tower's ranging us. How long?" "Working it," Nadia said. "Stand by." She fired. The round crossed 1,240 meters of moving air and struck the stone lip of the tower window a hand's width low and left, and blew a puff of gray dust off the masonry, and the gun kept firing. Miss. She did not swear. She watched where the dust had blown and read what the strike told her the wind had done to the round on its way across, and she corrected, and part of her heard her grandfather saying, "Believe the ground," and she believed it, and she fired again. This time the silhouette behind the gun folded and the gun stopped, and for a moment the compound below had a heartbeat of relief. It didn't last because the enemy had more men than one gunner, and a second fighter got up behind the gun almost at once, and Nadia had to do it again, and then the fighters on the high side, realizing where the fire was coming from, began to shift their attention up and out toward the finger ridge. "They've made us," Priest said. "High side elements traversing. We're getting company." Rounds began to come up at the ridge, snapping overhead, thumping into the reverse slope. Ochoa and Priest went to work on the nearest positions, and Nadia stayed on the tower, because if she came off the tower killed the compound, and so she lay there in the open on the spine of the ridge and did her arithmetic while the air around her filled with other people's fire. This was the part that would have broken most people. She could feel the exposure like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. Her body wanted to be behind the rock, not on top of it. There was a memory that arrived at exactly the wrong moment, the way the wrong memory always does. Her grandfather's striped rod, the weight of it across her shoulder on the 2-mile walk back to the truck, the smell of the theodolite case. She let the memory come and did not fight it, because fighting it would cost her more attention than letting it pass, and she pressed the sentence she used against the front of her mind. Measure it twice, believe the ground, and she made the tower go quiet a 3rd time. And a 4th. She keyed the radio to talk to the compound and to Wade, whose voice she'd heard reporting the leg. "Ranger 2-6, tell your corpsman to hold on. Tower's suppressed. I'm not leaving it." Nothing came back. She said it again. Ranger 2-6, longbow, acknowledge. Nothing, just the hiss, and under the hiss the flat sound of the wind starting to moan as the storm's leading edge reached the valley, and the terrible arithmetic of silence began. She had heard Wade's voice 10 minutes ago, and now the channel where his voice should be was empty, and the emptiness stretched 3 seconds, 5, 10, and in that stretch, her mind did the thing minds do and filled the silence with the worst version of itself. She kept her eye on the tower and her voice level, and inside she went cold. She had promised nothing to Wade yet, and already the not knowing was worse than any round coming up at the ridge. Then ragged, breathing hard. Longbow 2-6. Sorry, took cover. We're here. Cortman's hit, but he's working. Keep that tower off us. She let out a breath she would not have admitted to holding. The storm changed everything. The leading wall of dust rolled down the valley, and the light went from hard gold to a sick brown, and visibility began to close like a hand shutting. And Nadia understood that she had a window measured in minutes before she would not be able to see the tower at all. And after that, the 14 men in the compound would be blind and pinned and out of options, and the relief column still an hour out. The relief column, she keyed Salter. Wexler, longbow. What's the column's ETA? 50 minutes. They hit a washout, 50 at best. 50 minutes, and she had maybe 8 of visibility. She looked at the compound, and the tower, and the high ground, and the storm, and the 8 minutes, and understood that suppressing the tower 1 gunner at a time until she went blind was not a plan that ended with 14 men alive. It was a plan that ended with 14 men alive for 8 more minutes. There had to be a way to make the tower stop being a tower. In the compound, the 14th man, a young sapper named Cody Prewitt, who had been quiet the whole fight, took a round working across an open gap to reach Wade with more bandages, and went down in the open and lay there in the widening dark with the dust already stinging his eyes. And the men behind the good wall could not reach him, because reaching him meant crossing the tower's line, and the tower had come back to life again. Someone had to bring the tower down for good, and Nadia was one shooter with a magazine, not artillery, and she could not knock over 3 stories of stone with a rifle. But she could read ground, and she had been reading this ground since the sun came up. She had noticed it early and filed it away without knowing she'd need it. The tower did not stand on rock. It stood at the very lip of the village where the ground fell away into the dry watercourse that drained the whole slope. The same kind of watercourse she'd climbed to get up here, and its base sat on packed earth and rubble fill that some builder 100 years ago had tamped into the edge of the drainage to get his tower the extra height that let it dominate the valley. She had seen, when she first glassed it, a dark seam at the tower's foot where a rivulet of the coming storm's first rain, because rain rode the front edge of these dust storms. 10 violent minutes of it had already begun to run, and where water ran, that packed fill was doing what packed fill does when it gets wet on a slope. It was starting to move. "Ochoa," she said, "get on the glass, left base of the tower where it meets the low ground. Tell me what you see." Ochoa found it. The ground's wet there. There's a crack running down toward the wash. "That tower's sitting on fill, not rock," she said. And she said it slowly because she needed him to follow it, needed somebody besides her to believe the ground. Somebody built up the edge of that drainage 100 years ago to make the tower taller, its dirt and rubble held together by being dry. The storm's first rain is already in it. You see that crack? That's the fill starting to slump toward the wash. If that toe lets go, the whole corner drops, and a stone tower can't stand on 3 legs. You can't shoot down a tower, Cole. I'm not going to shoot the tower. She was already adjusting, already reading a new range, not to the window this time, but to the base, to the exact place where the wet seam ran, and where, if she read it right, a keystone piece of dry rubble was holding the slumping fill from becoming a slide. There's a rock at the toe of that fill doing all the work of holding the rest. Hackett's rock, my grandfather would have called it. The one stone in a wall that's carrying its neighbors. You pull that, and the wet ground above it has nothing to lean on. I put a round into the base of it, right where it's already cracked, right where the water's already working, and I let the storm do the rest. That's a 1 in 1,000 shot. It's a survey, she said. I measure it twice. And I believe the ground. She read the range, and it came up 910 to the toe of the fill. She read it again, 910. The wind was screaming now, and she read it off everything she had, the last visible thorn bush, the direction the rain was slanting, the way the dust was moving through the near valley. And she built the solution, and it was ugly and full of things she could not measure and had to trust. And she settled the reticle on a spot the size of a dinner plate at the base of a tower, 900 meters away in a dust storm, on a piece of wet rubble that either was or was not carrying the weight of the thing above it. "Longbow's taking one shot," she said on the net for the whole valley to hear. "Everybody in that compound, when the tower goes, you run for the vehicles. You will have one chance. 2-6, get your people ready to move on my call." "Say again, Longbow. When the tower does what?" "When it falls," she said. She let her breath out halfway and held it and felt the whole of her life narrow to the pad of her finger and the dinner plate at the base of the tower, and the wrong memory tried to come again, and she let it wait outside the door, and she pressed the shot. The round left and the wait began, and this was the part nobody who hasn't done it understands, that at that distance the bullet has to travel, and there is a full second and more where the round is in the air and nothing has happened yet and the world holds still with you. 1. The dust boiled. 2. The round struck the base of the wet fill at the toe of the tower, and for a heartbeat, nothing. Then the ground moved. The piece of rubble she'd shot, the one stone carrying its neighbors, cracked out of the wet earth and rolled, and the fill above it, already soaked, already leaning, already wanting to go, went. The whole toe of the drainage lip sagged and then slid, a slow brown wave of mud and stone pouring down into the wash, and the corner of the tower that stood on it dropped a foot, and then 2, and the stone tower that could not stand on 3 legs did exactly what she'd said it would do. It leaned. It groaned. They heard it 900 meters away, a deep grinding of stone on stone under the scream of the wind, and then the whole northwest corner let go, and the tower folded down into its own footprint and into the wash below it in a roar of masonry and dust, taking the gun and the men behind it down into the drainage, and the compound's death sentence collapsed with it. "Tower's down," Nadia said. 2-6, run now. For a second, nobody in the compound moved because it was too much to believe, and then Wade's voice, hoarse, screaming at his own men, "Go, go, go!" And the 14 men in the compound came up off the good wall and ran for the vehicles through the swirling dust while the high-side fighters, half of them still staring at where their tower had been, fired blind into the murk. But there was a man down in the open. Prewitt, the young sapper, was still lying in the gap he'd been crossing, and in the dust nobody could see him, and the vehicles were loading, and Nadia, 1,200 meters up on the ridge, could just make out, through the closing brown, one shape not moving on the ground. 2-6. You've got a man down in the open, north side of the yard, near the well. Do not leave without him. Can't see him, Longbow. We can't see anything. I can see him. Get a truck to the well, and I'll walk you on to him. And she did. She lay on the spine of the ridge with the storm eating the last of her visibility, and she talked a driver she'd never met across a compound she'd never stood in. 10 meters left. Stop, he's at your 2 o'clock, 6 feet there, and 2 men jumped down and grabbed Prewitt under the arms and threw him into the bed. And the truck reversed out through the gap as the dust closed over everything, and the valley went brown and blind and silent except for the wind. That's 14. Nadia said. Then, quieter. Not for the radio, just for herself. 14. She came down off the ridge with Ochoa and Priest as the worst of the storm rolled over them, the 3 of them feeling their way down the watercourse in a brownout with cloths over their faces, and by the time they reached the truck the rain had come and gone in its 10 violent minutes and the dust had settled into a fine paste on everything, and Nadia's hands, which had been perfectly still on the rifle for 2 hours, would not stop shaking when she tried to fold the bipod. She looked at them with a kind of detached surprise, as if they belonged to somebody else, and then she jammed them under her arms and got in the truck and looked out the window and didn't talk the whole way back. The relief column reached the compound 40 minutes later and found it empty. The men were already coming home the other way. In the operations tent at Wexler, a private who had laughed 3 weeks ago at a joke about clearing a lane sat very still and did not laugh at anything for a long time. The 14 men came in on a string of dust-caked vehicles just after noon, and the wounded went one way and the rest stood around in the vehicle bay not knowing what to do with their hands, and Corman Wade came in on a stretcher with a tourniquet on his leg and his eyes open, looking for something, and when they carried him past the spot where Nadia was sitting, he made them stop. Ellis Wade was 34 years old, and he had a wife named Carol in a town in the flat middle of the country, and the thing waiting for him at home that he had not stopped thinking about the whole time he lay against that wall was that Carol was 7 months along with their first, a girl they'd already named, and he had promised out loud, in the kitchen, with his hand on her belly, that he would be there in the room when it happened. He had spent 2 hours against a mud wall doing the arithmetic of that promise against a machine gun in a tower and coming up short. He caught Nadia's sleeve as they set the stretcher down. "You the one on the ridge?" "I was on the ridge." "Am I going to make it?" He said it flat, a man who'd patched enough people to know that hope was a thing other people gave you and facts were a thing you could use. "Don't tell me it'll be fine. Tell me the truth. Am I going to see home?" Nadia looked at the leg and at the tourniquet, which was good, and at his color, which was better than it should have been, and she gave him the only thing she had that was worth anything, which was a fact. "Your tourniquet's good, and you didn't lose enough to die from. The bone'll take months, but you'll walk. You'll be home before the leg is." She paused. "Whatever's at home, it's still going to be there." Something in his face came apart and knit back together. "My wife's having a baby in September," he said. "I told her I'd be there." "Then be there," Nadia said. And then she did a thing she was better at than shooting, which nobody at Wexler had seen yet. She took the field scissors from the med kit beside the stretcher and cut away the dust-stiffened fabric around the wound so the surgeon wouldn't have to, her hands, steady again now, the shaking gone as suddenly as it had come, doing the small, careful, close work as neatly as they'd done the large, terrible, far work. And she talked to him the whole time about nothing, about names for baby girls, until they came to take him to the table. The investigating officer arrived from the regional headquarters 2 days later because 14 men walking out of a closed compound and a stone tower coming down in a dust storm generates paperwork. And the paperwork had a name, and the name was Major Leanne Voss. Voss was not a cruel woman, but she was a precise one, and she had a file in front of her that did not add up, and she sat across a folding table from Nadia in the intelligence shop with Salter standing against the wall, and she went at the file the way a good officer goes at a thing that doesn't make sense. "Corporal Cole, your selection record has you finishing last in your marksmanship course, bottom of 31 candidates." "Yes, ma'am." "And I'm asked to believe you made a 1,200-meter shot on a machine gun position in a 30-knot crosswind, and then a 900-meter shot that brought down a fortified tower in a dust storm on your first combat deployment as an augmentee." "You're not asked to believe it, ma'am. There's a drone feed." Salter made a sound against the wall that he turned into a cough. Voss looked up. "Explain to me how a person finishes last in a shooting course and does what the feed shows you did." And Nadia, who had never explained it to anyone because nobody had ever asked in a way that deserved an answer, explained it. "The course scores on time and volume, ma'am, rounds on target inside a clock. I don't shoot fast. I've never shot fast. My grandfather taught me to measure a thing twice before I trust it, and measuring twice costs seconds, and the course punishes seconds. Everybody who beat me put more rounds downrange faster than I did. I put fewer rounds exactly where I wanted them, slower. On a scorecard, that's last place." She let that sit. "On a ridge above a compound with 14 men in it and one round that matters, it's the other thing." Voss was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the file, and then she did something Nadia respected. She picked up her pen and drew a line through something on the page. "The course measures the wrong thing," she said, half to herself. "For what you did, it measures exactly the wrong thing." She closed the file. "I'm going to write that down, Corporal, that the metric that ranked you last is the metric that would have gotten those men killed if they'd sent one of the people who beat you." "Yes, ma'am. That's all. Thank you." And as Nadia stood, Voss added, not looking up, For what it's worth, my father was a surveyor. I know exactly the man you're describing. It was the middle of the night 3 days after when Wade found her awake. Neither of them could sleep. He was in a wheelchair with the leg out straight in front of him, parked outside the aid station because the ward was hot and the night was cool, and Nadia was sitting on the step because she had stopped trying to sleep around 2 and come out to look at the stars, which out here past all the lights were a spill of them, thick as spilled salt. She sat down on the concrete near his chair, and for a while neither of them said anything, and an owl went over somewhere, hunting. "I've been doing the math," Wade said finally, "on the tower, on that shot into the ground." He turned his head. "You didn't know that was going to work?" "Not for sure." Nadia was quiet a moment. Out here in the dark with a man who had been at the other end of it, she could say the thing she had not said to Voss or Salter or anyone. "No," she said, "I didn't. I read the ground, and the ground said maybe, 60% maybe. I told Ochoa it was a survey because I needed him to believe it, and I needed to believe it. But the truth is, I took a 60% shot with 14 lives on it because 40 was what you had if I didn't." She had never said a number like that out loud. It sat between them in the dark. "You know what I was thinking about against that wall?" Wade said. "I wasn't thinking I was going to die. I was thinking I was going to break a promise to my wife. I told her I'd be in the room." He rubbed his face with both hands. "And I'd already decided I'd broken it. I'd already grieved it lying there. And then the tower came down." "You didn't break it," Nadia said. "That's my point." He looked at her. "You think you gambled with our lives. From where I was lying, you didn't gamble with anything. You were the only person in that whole valley doing math instead of praying. 60% is a miracle when the other number is 0. You didn't take 40 away from us. You gave us 60 we didn't have." He shook his head slowly. "You've been carrying that like a sin for 3 days. I've been watching you. Put it down. You didn't roll dice with us. You bought us the only chance there was, and you bought it with the one thing you're better at than anybody I ever met." Nadia looked at the stars and didn't say anything for a long time, and when she did, her voice wasn't quite steady. "My grandfather used to say, 'Believe the ground,'" she said. "I've said it my whole life. First time I ever had to believe it when it might have been lying to me. It wasn't lying. No," she said. "It wasn't." The letter in her footlocker was still there, and on the 4th night she took it out and read it again, all 3 pages, and this time she did not put it away. She had been telling herself for 11 weeks that she couldn't answer Ruth Petrov because she didn't know what to say, and sitting there on her bunk with the tower still coming down behind her eyes every time she closed them, she finally understood that the problem had never been what to say. The problem was that answering meant the ranch would end, and she had been keeping the whole valley of her childhood alive by refusing to look directly at the fact that it was already over. Ruth was selling. Ruth was old. The Theodolite summers were 40 years gone, and her grandfather was gone, and the ranch was the last physical thing standing in that valley that knew who she had been before the rifle. And if she wrote back, she'd be signing off on the survey of a country that no longer closed. Salter found her with the letter in her hand the next morning, and she didn't hide it, and he sat down on the bucket he always sat on, and she told him, because he was the kind of man you could tell things to. "So write her back," Salter said. "It's not that simple." "It is exactly that simple, and you know it, which is why you're miserable." He tapped the letter. "This isn't about what to say. You've known what to say for 11 weeks. It's about not wanting to sign the paper that says the place is really going. I've watched you range a tower to the inch in a dust storm. Don't tell me you can't measure this." He stood, knees cracking. "You told a dying man to be there for the thing that mattered. You want to take your own advice, or you want to be a hypocrite about it?" Nobody handed her anything. There was no perfect stranger with the missing piece. No letter that crossed with hers in the mail. No phone call that made the decision for her. There was only Nadia Cole sitting on a bunk in the high desert with a pen, finally doing the arithmetic she'd been refusing to do, and understanding that the ranch was going to end whether she wrote or not, and that the only thing her silence was preserving was her own ability to pretend otherwise. She had told Wade to be in the room. She had told a man to go home to the thing that mattered while there was still a room to be in. She wrote 3 pages back. She told Ruth she would come, that she wanted the theodolite if it was still in the barn, and the striped rod and the steel tape and nothing else, and that she was sorry it had taken her so long, that the truth was she'd been afraid to say goodbye to the valley and had made Ruth wait while she got over being a coward about it. She sealed it and walked it to the mail run herself before she could think better of it, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 11 weeks let go. Hollis came to her 4 days after the tower, and it cost him more than anyone would ever know. He'd already done the thing that came before the words, though nobody had told Nadia. When the after-action write-up went up the chain, there'd been a line in the first draft, inserted by a headquarters staffer who wanted the story clean, crediting the tower's collapse to the storm alone, act of God, weather. Hollis had seen it, and Hollis had gone to Reyes and to Voss and said, on the record, with his name on it, that it was not the storm, that he had watched the feed, that Cole read that ground and put a round into the one place that would make the storm do the work, and that anybody who wrote it down as weather was a coward stealing from a better soldier than themselves. He'd made himself unpopular with people who outranked him to do it, and he'd done it without telling Nadia, and she only found out because Voss mentioned it. Then he came to find her at the range of all places where she was zeroing a rifle in the flat evening light. He stood there for a while, not saying anything. Then, that first morning, when I told everyone to clear a lane, he stopped, started again. I read your file and I decided I knew you, and then you put 10 rounds in a card, and I decided that was luck, because the other thing meant I'd been wrong out loud, in front of my men, and I'd rather have been right and cruel than wrong, and... He stopped again. His jaw worked. I've been doing this 18 years. I've never seen anybody do what you did on that ridge, and I spent 3 weeks calling you the worst shooter I ever saw, and the truth is, you might be the best I'll ever stand next to, and I was too. He couldn't find the end of it. I'm sorry, for the lane, for all of it. It was a small thing to do, and I'm a better soldier than that, and I did it anyway. Nadia looked at him for a moment. She could have made it cheap and let him off, and she could have made it a punishment and held it over him, and she did neither. You told the truth about the tower, she said. That's the part that counts. And that was all, and it was enough. And Hollis nodded once like a man setting down something heavy and went to help her pick up brass in the last of the light. The letter that undid her came 10 days later, and it had no rank in it anywhere. It was from Carol Wade, forwarded through 3 offices, written in a round, careful hand on paper with a border of small flowers, and Nadia stood in the vehicle bay and read it and did not know how to hold her face. Carol Wade had written to the woman who kept Ellis alive. She didn't have a rank or a job title. She just wrote the woman on the ridge to say thank you, except she didn't say thank you because thank you was too small, and she knew it. She wrote that she'd been asleep when the call came that Ellis was hit, and she'd stood in the kitchen where he'd made his promise with the phone in her hand and felt the floor go out from under her. And then 2 days later, there was a second call, and it was Ellis's own voice saying he was coming home. She wrote that the baby was a girl, still, that they were still going to call her what they'd planned, and she wrote one line that Nadia would carry for the rest of her life. I don't know what you are or how you do what you do, but my daughter is going to have a father because of you, and I am going to tell her your name before I tell her almost anything else. Nadia read it 3 times, and then she had to go and stand behind the vehicle bay by herself for a while because she did not know what to do with a thing that large handed to her so plainly. She had a fact for a dying man and a survey for a tower and a level voice for a radio, and she had nothing at all for this. She folded the letter very carefully and put it in her breast pocket over the flowers, and she kept it there. Foss, the mechanic, was the one who finally said the thing, because Foss had been carrying it since the motor pool at dusk weeks ago, and now he had the words. He caught her outside the mess a week after the tower, and he was not a talker, and he stood there working up to it. I saw you break down your rifle, he said, before any of this, first week, out by the vehicle bay. Okay, Nadia said, not unkindly. I couldn't figure out why it stuck with me. I watched 100 guys do that, and then the tower came down and I finally got it. He looked at her, plain and certain. Everybody else out here is fighting the ground, fighting the wind, fighting the distance, fighting the rock. You're the only one I ever saw who listens to it. Watching you take that rifle apart was like watching somebody who already knew how the day was going to end. That's what I couldn't say. You don't fight it. You listen to it, and then you tell the rest of us what it said." He went red, having said more than he'd said all month, and shrugged and went in to eat. Reyes changed her orders before she left. He did it in his own office, standing, and he did not hide behind the paperwork. "I signed the thing that treated you as a line on a Manning document," he said. 11 weeks ago. Attached, augmentee, filler. I did that. Nobody made me." He handed her a folder. "You're not an augmentee anymore. You're going to a precision unit that actually knows what to do with what you are, if you want it, and the paperwork says so. And I wrote the recommendation myself so that the next person who reads your file reads the truth on the first line instead of the last." He put out his hand. "I was wrong about you in a way that could have cost 14 men. I don't get to be casual about that. I'm sorry." She shook his hand and took the folder, and she was already thinking about the valley and the theodolite in the barn, and a place she had to go before anything else. 9 months later, on a spring morning in the flat brown country where she'd grown up, Nadia Cole stood in the doorway of an empty barn with a steel tape in her hand and the striped rod leaning against her shoulder, and watched the light come up over ground her grandfather had measured 50 years before. She'd taken the transfer, and then she'd taken leave, and she'd driven the long straight roads back to the valley the week before the sale closed and helped Ruth Petrov pack up a life, and Ruth, who was smaller than Nadia remembered and sharper than ever, had watched her carry the theodolite out to the truck and said, "You waited long enough, girl. Thought I'd have to leave it to you in a will." And Nadia had said she was sorry, and Ruth had said, "Don't be sorry. Be here," which was the same thing a corpsman had said to her in a compound she'd never stood in, and the two sentences fit together in her chest like they'd been cut from the same board. Ruth had moved into town, into a small bright house with a garden she was already terrorizing into shape, and she was, against all Nadia's fears, completely fine, better than fine, freed of the ranch she'd been chained to for 40 years, playing cards 3 nights a week and beating people who ought to know better. She wrote Nadia every month now, and Nadia wrote back within the week, every time, because she had learned exactly once what 11 weeks of silence cost and did not intend to learn it twice. There was a photograph in Nadia's wallet that Ellis Wade had sent her of a red-faced infant girl in a yellow blanket, and on the back in his blocky handwriting it said, "She's here. I was in the room. Her name is Nadia." Wade was out of the service now, walking with a limp that would fade, and a cane he was already too proud to use, teaching a first responder course at a community college 2 towns over from where he'd made his promise in a kitchen. And he'd called Nadia the day the baby came, and neither of them had been able to say much of anything, which was its own kind of conversation. She still could not fold a bipod or a map or a bath towel without her hands going still and careful in a particular way at the last moment, a small deliberate steadying, a check as if some part of her was always confirming a range one more time before she trusted it. People who spent time around her noticed it and were kind enough not to say anything, and she never explained it because there was nothing to explain. It was just a thing her hands did now, the way the shaking had come once and gone, leaving behind this small ritual of measuring twice in her fingers where the fear used to be. She'd catch herself doing it and let it happen. Believe the ground. Even a folded towel. She set up the theodolite in the doorway of the empty barn out of nothing but the wish to, and she ran a traverse across the yard she'd played in as a child, sighting the rod against the old fence posts, closing the loop the way her grandfather had taught her, and it closed to the inch. She stood there in the risen sun with the numbers in her notebook and the valley quiet all around her, going on to whatever it would become without a name she'd recognize, and she was not sad. She had said her goodbye, and it had closed clean. She thought about the 14. She thought about them the way you think about a debt you've paid, lightly and with your whole chest. Somewhere a girl named Nadia was 3 months old in a yellow blanket. Somewhere a corpsman was teaching people to keep each other alive. 14 men had gone home to 14 unfinished things, and the tower was a heap of stone in a wash in a country she'd likely never see again, and none of it would have happened if she'd shot a little faster and finished a little higher and become the thing the scorecard wanted instead of the thing her grandfather had made. She packed the theodolite into its case, and the rod and the tape into the truck, and she took one more look at the ground. Then she got in and pulled out onto the long, straight road with the striped rod across the back seat and the sun coming up level in her eyes, driving easy, seeing the whole country clear out to where it broke against the far line of hills, measuring the distance without meaning to, believing it.